The Chronicles of Prydain by Lloyd Alexander. Book 5, The High King. Chapter 12, The Red Fallows. All night the destruction raged, and by morning Cardathiel lay in ruins. Fires smoldered where once had stood the lofty halls. The swords and axes of the Cauldron-born had leveled the hemlock grove near the mounds of honor. In the dawn light, the shattered walls seemed blood-stained. The army of Prydain, denying even the right of burial for the slain, had driven the defenders into the hills east of Cardathiel. It was there, amid the turmoil of the makeshift camp, the companions found one another again. Faithful Gurgi still bore the banner of the White Pig, though its staff had been broken and the emblem slashed almost beyond recognition. Lion, with Fluider beside her, crouched in the scant shelter of a rocky outcropping. Her tail twitched, and her yellow eyes still glowed with anger. Heavyhead the smith built a campfire, and Taran, Ilanwe, and Call tried to warm themselves at the embers. Lasar, though sorely wounded, had lived through the battle, but the enemy had taken cruel toll of the Comet men. Among those who lay stark and silent on the trampled battleground was Leneo, son of Lonwen. One of the handful of survivors from the inner defenses of the fortress was Glue. A warrior of Dawn, finding him lost and dazed outside the walls, had taken pity on his plight and brought him to the camp. The former giant was pathetically glad to rejoin the companions, though he was still too terrified and trembling to do more than mumble a few words. With a torn cloak over his shoulders, he huddled beside the fire and held his head in his hands. Gwydion stood alone. For long, his eyes did not leave the column of black smoke staining the sky above the ruins of Cardathiel. At last, he turned away and ordered all who had lived out the day to assemble. Taliesin came to stand before them, and taking up Fluider's harp, sang a lament for the slain. Amid the black pines, the voice of the chief bard rose in deep sorrow. Yet it was sorrow without despair, and while the notes of the harp were heavy, laden with mourning, they held as well the clear strains of life and hope. As the melody died away, Taliesin lifted his head and spoke quietly. Each broken stone of Cardathiel shall be a mark of honor, and the whole valley a resting place for Math, son of Mathwani, and all our dead. But a high king still lives. As I honor him, so do I honor all who stand with him. He turned to Gwydion and bowed deeply. The warriors drew their swords and cried out the name of the new High King of Prydain. Gwydion then called the companions to him.
We meet only to part, he said. Pryderi's victory gives us one choice and one hope. Though messengers bear tidings of our defeat to King Smite and his army and to the lords of the north, we dare not await their help. What we do must be done now. Not even a battle host tenfold greater than Pryderi's can withstand the Cauldron-born. Army after army can be flung against them only to swell the ranks of the slain. Yet here is the seed of our hope, Gwydion said. Never in man's memory has Aran sent his deathless warriors abroad in such strength. He has taken the greatest risk for the greatest gain, and he has triumphed. But his triumph has become his moment of greatest weakness. Without the Cauldron-born to guard it, Anuvan lies open to attack. So must we attack it.
Do you believe, then, that Anuvan is unguarded? Taran asked quickly. Are there none other who serve Aran?
Mortal warriors, surely, replied Gwydion, and perhaps a force of huntsmen. But we have strength to overcome them if the Cauldron-born do not reach Anuvan in time to aid them.
Gwydion's blood-streaked face was hard as stone.
They must not reach Anuvan. As their power dwindles, the longer they remain beyond the Death Lord's realm, so at all cost must they be hindered, delayed, turned from every path they follow.
Call nodded.
Indeed, this is our only hope whatever, and it must be done quickly, for now they will seek to return quickly to their master. But can we overtake them once they are on the march? Can we hinder them and at the same time mount our own attack against Anuvan?
Not if we journey as one army, Gwydion said. Instead, we must separate into two bands. The first and smaller shall be given as many horses as can be spared and hasten to pursue the Cauldron-born. The second shall make their way to the valley of Kinneville and follow its river northwest to the coast. The valley land is gentle, and with forced marches, the sea can be reached in no more than 2 days. The sea must aid our venture, Gwydion continued, for Pryderi can too easily forbid our army's journey over land.
He turned to Taran.
Math, son of Mathwini, spoke to you of the ships that bore the sons of Dawn from the summer country. These vessels were not abandoned. Still seaworthy, they have ever been held ready against the day of need. A faithful folk guard them in a hidden harbor near the mouth of the river Kinnival. They will carry us to the western shore of Prydain, closer to the bastions of Anuvan itself. 2 men alone have knowledge of the harbor, Gwydion added. One was Math, son of Mathwini. The other is myself. I have no choice but to lead the seaward march. As for the other journey, he said to Taran, will you accept to lead it?
Taran raised his head. I serve as you command.
I do not command this, replied Gwydion. I order no man to take such a task against his will, and all who follow you must do so willingly.
Then it is my will to do so, Taran answered. The companions murmured their assent.
The vessels of the sons of Dawn are swift, Gwydion said. I ask you to delay the Cauldron-born but a little while, yet all hangs on that little.
If I fail, Taran said, how shall I send word to you? Should the Cauldron warriors reach Anuvan ahead of you, your plan cannot succeed and you must turn back. Gwydion shook his head.
There can be no turning back, for there is no further hope. Should either of us fail, all our lives are forfeit.
Lissar, Heviad, and all the other comet folk chose to follow Taran. With them were joined the surviving warriors of Fluid or Flam, and together they made the greater portion of Taran's band. To the surprise of the companions, Glue chose to ride with them. The former giant had recovered from his fright, at least enough to regain much of his customary peevishness. He had, however, regained all of his appetite and demanded food in great quantity from Gurgi's wallet of provisions.
I've had my fill of being dragged here and there by the scruff of the neck,
said Glue, licking his fingers.
And now I'm either to be put on a ship or cast among a herd of horses. Very well, I shall take the latter, for at least it's not so wet and salty. But I assure you, I would have agreed to neither when I was a giant.
Fluider glowered at the former giant and spoke apart with Taran.
It seems we're doomed, on top of all our other woes, to put up with that whining weasel at every step. And I can't help feeling that in the back of that punny little mind, he's hoping somehow to feather his own nest.
The bard shook his head and gave Taran a sorrowful look.
But are any nests left to feather? There's not a safe place, even for Glue, to hide his head.
Gurgi had tied the banner of the white pig to a new staff, but he sighed mournfully at the tattered emblem.
Oh, poor piggy,
he cried.
None can see her now, for she is torn into threadings and shreddings. Oh. I promised to sew another, Eilonwe said, as soon as... She stopped abruptly and said no more, as she climbed beside Lalugar. Taran saw her troubled glance. The Princess of Lear would wait long, he feared, before her hands worked with an embroidery needle. And unspoken, but in his heart, was the dread that none of them might see Caer Dallben again. At the end of their grim race, death might be the only prize. Armed with spears and swords, the warriors were mounted and ready. With a last farewell to Gwydion, the companions rode westward from the hills. It was Call's judgment that the Cauldron-born would march directly to Anuvan, following the straightest and shortest path. At the head of the column, winding its way from the snow-swept heights, Lissar rode beside Taran. The skill of the young shepherd eased their passage, and he guided them swiftly toward the lowlands, unseen by Pryderi's army, which had begun to withdraw from the valley around Cirdathiel. For some days they journeyed, and Taran began to fear the retreating Cauldron-born had outdistanced them. Nevertheless, they could do no more than press on as quickly as possible, southward now, passing through long stretches of sparse woodland. It was Gurgi who first sighted the deathless warriors. The creature's face went gray with fright as he pointed to an expanse of rock-strewn plain. Glue blinked, choked, and could barely swallow the food he was munching.
Ilanwe watched silently, and the bard gave a low whistle of dismay. Taran's heart sank at the sight of the column, moving like a long serpent over the flatlands. He turned questioningly to Call. Can we hold them off at all?
A pebble can turn aside an avalanche, said Call, or a twig stem a flood.
I dare say, muttered Fluider. What happens to the twig or pebble afterward? I should rather not think about.
Taran was about to signal the warriors to form for an attack, but Call took his arm.
Not yet, my boy,
he said.
First, I would be sure of the path these creatures of Aran mean to follow to Anuvin. If the twig is to do its work, it must be well placed.
For the rest of that day and the morning of the next, the companions matched their own progress to the march of the Cauldron-born, sometimes ahead, sometimes along their flank, but never losing sight of the deathless warriors. It seemed to Taran that the Cauldron-born had slowed their pace. The dark column moved without faltering, but heavily, as though burdened. He spoke of this to Call, who nodded in satisfaction.
Their strength ebbs a little,
Call said.
Time works for us, but I think we must soon work for ourselves.
They had reached a broad, winding belt of wasteland where grassless earth stretched away on either side as far as the eye could see. The dead ground was broken, rutted as though ill-plowed, slashed with deep ditches and gullies. No tree, no shrub rose from the dull red earth, and nowhere did Taran see the faintest sign that any growing thing had ever flourished here. He looked at it uneasily, chilled not only by the bitter wind, but by the silence that hovered like frozen mist about the lifeless land. He asked in a low voice, What place is this? Call grimaced.
The Red Fallows, it is called now. At the moment,
he added wryly,
I fear it is much the way my garden looks.
I have heard it spoken of, Taran said, though I believe to be no more than a traveler's tale. Call shook his head.
No traveler's tale whatever. Men have long shunned it, yet once it was the fairest realm in Prydain. The land was such that all manner of things would grow, as if overnight. Grains, vegetables, fruits. Why, in size and savor, the apples from the orchards here would have made mine look like shriveled windfalls beside them. A prize it was to be won and held, and many lords fought for its possession. But in the fighting over it, year after year, the hooves of steeds trampled the ground, the blood of warriors stained it. In time the land died, as did those who strove to claim it from their fellows, and soon its blight crept far beyond the battlegrounds.
Call sighed.
I know this land, my boy, and it does not please me to see it again. In my younger days, I too marched with the battle hosts and left not a little of my own blood in the Fallows.
Will they never flourish? Taran asked, looking with dismay at the wasted expanse. Prydain could be a rich land with the abundance they might bear. It would be a shame worse than bloodshed to leave these fields thus. Will the soil not yield again if it were labored well?
Who can say? Answered Call. Perhaps. No man has tilled it for years long past. But for us now, that is all by the by.
He gestured toward the heights, rising sharply at the distant edge of the fields.
The Red Fallows stretch along the hills of Bran Galid, southwestward almost of Anuvin. From there it is the longest but easiest path to Aran's realm, and if I judge aright, of the Cauldron-born will follow it swiftly to their master.
We must not let them pass, Taran replied. Here we must make our stand and hinder them as best we can. He glanced toward the heights. We must force them into the hills. Among rocks and broken ground, we might set snares or lure them into ambush. It is all we can hope to do.
Perhaps, said Call. Though before you choose, know this. The hills of Bran Galid are also give a path to Anuvin and a shorter one. They rise sharper as they go westward and turn soon to steep crags. There stands Mount Dragon, the highest peak, guarding the iron portals of the land of death. It is a harsh passage, cruel and dangerous, more so for us than for the deathless Cauldron-born. We can lose our lives. They cannot.
Taran frowned anxiously, then said with a bitter laugh, Indeed, there is no happy choice, old friend. The path of the Red Fallows is easier but longer. The mountain way harder and shorter. He shook his head. I have not the wisdom to decide. Have you no counsel for me?
The choice must be yours, war leader,
answered Call.
Yet as a grower of turnips and cabbages, I might say, if you trust your strength, the mountains may be friend as much as foe.
Taran smiled at him sorrowfully. Little trust do I put in the strength of an assistant pig keeper, he said after a long moment, but much in the strength and wisdom of his companions. So be it. We must drive the Cauldron warriors into the hills.
No, this too, said Call. If such is your choice, it must be done at this place and at all cost. Farther southward, the fallows widen, the plain grows broad and flat, and there is danger the Cauldron-born may escape our reach if we fail there.
Taran grinned. Now that is simple enough for an assistant pig keeper to understand. Taran rode back through the column of warriors to tell them of the plan they were to follow. Though he cautioned Ilanwe and Gurgi to hold themselves as far as possible from the fray, he could judge, with little difficulty, that the Princess of Lear had no intention of heeding his warning. As for Taran himself, the decision he had taken lay heavily on him. His doubts and fears only sharpened as the horsemen rallied at the fringe of woodland, and as the moment of their advance across the fallows drew closer. He felt cold. The wind muttering across the rutted fields seeped through his cloak like an icy flood. He caught sight of Call, who winked at him and nodded his bald crown in a quick gesture. Taran raised the horn to his lips and signaled the warriors forward. At Call's counsel, the companions and each horseman had cut stout branches from the trees. Now, like ants burdened with straws, the column entered the wasteland, struggling across the ruts and gullies. To their right rose the ruins of a wall, some ancient boundary, useless now, whose broken slabs stretched over much of the fallow's width and ended near the steep ascent to the Brangaleed hills. It was there that Taran, with all haste, led the toiling band of warriors. The Cauldron-born, it seemed to him, had already glimpsed them, for the dark column quickened its own pace, thrusting rapidly across the fallows. Taran's horsemen had dismounted and raced to fling their branches between the gaps in the wall. The column of Cauldron-born marched closer. Beside them rode mounted huntsmen, garbed in heavy jackets of wolfskin, the troop captains, whose harsh commands reached Taran's ears like the snapping of a lash. Their orders rang in a language unknown to him, but Taran well understood their scornful tone and the brutal laughter that spat from their lips. As at Kirdathiel, the Cauldron-born held their ranks, striding onward, unwavering. They had drawn their swords from their belts of heavy bronze. The bronze studs covering their leather breastplates glinted dully. Their pallid faces were frozen, as empty as their staring eyes. Suddenly, the horns of the captain screamed like hawks. The Cauldron warriors stiffened, and in another moment lunged forward at a faster gait, running heavily across the dark red earth. The men of the Comets leaped to their makeshift barrier of rocks and branches. The Cauldron-born flung themselves against the ruined wall and strove to clamber upwards. Fluider, leaving Lion with Glue amid the other steeds, had snatched up a long branch and, shouting at the top of his voice, thrust it like a spear into the mass of climbing warriors. Beside him, Gurgi flailed a huge staff, striking desperately at the rising wave. Heedless of Taran's warning outcry, Ilanwe plied her spear, and it was under her furious onslaught that the first Cauldron warrior toppled and fell, struggling to regain his footing amid the ranks that streamed silently over him. Taran's band redoubled their efforts, slashing, sweeping, fending off the mute foe with all their strength. Others among the deathless troops lost their footing as the surging attackers threw themselves blindly against the barrier, only to be struck down by the lashing staves and spear shafts of the Comet men.
"They fear us!" cried the bard in frenzied joy. "See, they turn away! If we can't slay them, great Bellin, we can still push them back!"
In the turmoil of warriors and the shrilling of the huntsmen's horns, Taran glimpsed the ranks of Cauldron-born veer from the threatening hedge of spears. His heart leaped. Were the captains indeed fearful of the hindrance, of the waning power of their mute host? Even now, the attacking wave seemed weaker, though he could not be sure that it was no more than his hope that made it appear so. No longer was he even sure how long they had struggled at the wall. Wearied by the endless thrusts of his spear, he felt it had been forever, although the sky was still light. Of a sudden, he realized Fluider was right. The silent mass of deathless warriors had fallen back. The huntsman captains had taken their decision. Like beasts that find their prey too well hidden and unworthy of their efforts, the mounted leaders sounded a long, wavering note on their horns. The ranks of Cauldron-born swung toward the hills of Bran Gilead. Cheers burst from the Comet warriors. Taran spun about to find Call, but the old warrior was hastening farther along the wall. Taran cried out to him, then in dismay realized what Call had seen. A band of Cauldron-born had broken from the main force and now strove to clamber through an undefended breach. Call reached it as the first Cauldron warrior had begun to force himself over the stones. The old man was upon him in an instant and, dropping his spear, seized the warrior in his burly arms and flung him downward. While other Cauldron-born swarmed to the breach, Call snatched out his sword and laid about him right and left, heedless of the attackers' hacking and stabbing blades. Shouting in wrath as the weapon shattered in his hands, the stout farmer cast it away and struck out with his heavy fists. The deathless warriors clung to him, striving to pull him into their midst, but he shook them off, ripped a sword from the grasp of a tottering Cauldron-born, and swung it as if he meant to fell an oak with a single stroke. Taran was at Call's side in a moment. The horns of the huntsmen screamed the signal to retreat. Now Taran realized the attack had truly ended with this last convulsion. The Cauldron-born had begun to scale the heights. The red fallows were barred to them. Call was bleeding heavily from his head. His fleece-lined coat, blood-soaked, was slashed and tattered by the blades of the Cauldron-born. Quickly, Taran and Fluider carried him between them to the bottom of the wall. Gurgi, whimpering in distress, hurried to aid them. Eilonwe had torn off her cloak to cushion the old farmer against the harsh stones.
"After them, my boy,"
Call gasped.
"Give them no rest. The twigs have turned the flood, but it must be turned again, and many times if you would block the way to Anuvan."
"One stout oak tree has turned it," Taran replied. "Once again I have leaned on it." He took Call's work-hardened hands and gently tried to lift him. Call's broad face grinned and he shook his head.
"I am a farmer," he murmured, "but warrior enough to know my own death wound. Go along, my boy. Carry with you no more burdens than you must."
"What then?" answered Taran. "Will you have me break the promise I made, that we will dig and weed together?" But the words came painfully as a dagger wound. Eilonwe, her face drawn, looked anxiously at Taran.
"I had hoped one day to sleep in my own garden," Call said. "The drone of bees would have pleased me more than the horn of Gwyn the hunter, but I see the choice was not to be mine."
"The horn of Gwyn does not blow for you," said Taran. "You hear the Cauldron-born summoned to retreat." Yet even as he spoke, the faint notes of a horn rose above the hills, and its dying echoes trembled like shadows over the wasteland. Eilonwe covered her face with her hands.
"See to our plantings, my boy,"
said Call. "We shall both do so," answered Taran. "The weeds will no more stand against you than did Aron's warriors." The stout old farmer did not answer. It was a long moment before Taran realized that Call was dead. While the grieving companions gathered stones from the ruined wall, with his own hands Taran hollowed out a grave in the harsh earth, allowing none other to aid him in this task. Even when the humble mound had risen above Call, son of Callfluer, he did not move from it, but ordered Fluider and the companions to press on into the hills of Bran Gilead, where he would join them before nightfall. For long he stood silently. As the sky darkened, at last he turned away and climbed heavily astride Malenless. He halted another moment by the mound of red earth and rough stones. "Sleep well, grower of turnips and gatherer of apples," Taran murmured. "You are far from where you long to be. So too am I." Alone, he rode across the darkening fallows to the waiting hills.